Welcome to Conspiracist. Today, we're undertaking a deep dive into a pretty fascinating hypothesis.
Yes, the idea that governments, or maybe powerful institutions, have intentionally concealed archaeological evidence.
Evidence that supposedly challenges, well, the whole accepted timeline of human evolution in history.
Right. This concept often goes by the name forbidden archaeology.
And it suggests there are artifacts, maybe even entire sites, that just don't fit with mainstream scientific understanding.
And crucially, that this evidence isn't just ignored, it's actively suppressed.
So our goal today is really to objectively look at the claims and the reasoning presented in our source material about this hypothesis.
Precisely. We need to unpack what forbidden archaeology actually means. At its heart, it's about these so-called out-of-place artifacts, or OPARTs, as they're sometimes known.
Things found where they shouldn't be,
Yeah.
according to current models.
Exactly. Discoveries that seem to conflict with our established scientific knowledge about human history, our evolution, our technological development.
The idea being, these finds imply humans were around much earlier or were more advanced than we think at certain points in the past.
That's the core suggestion.
Now, one of the main arguments we see in the material backing this idea, it's the claim that there's actually a lot of data out there that doesn't fit.
There's a specific reference to geologist Virginia Steen McIntyre.
Right. She's quoted as saying something like, "What an eye-opener. I didn't realize how many sites and how much data are out there that don't fit modern concepts of human evolution."
And that quote is often used to imply, well, a hidden reservoir of suppressed evidence.
It suggests there's this significant body of work just waiting to be acknowledged.
Tied into that is the assertion that the scientific community itself is perhaps biased against this kind of evidence.
How so?
Well, the review of the book Forbidden Archaeology that we looked at, it suggests scientists tend to automatically, almost reflexively, dismiss or explain away finds that don't easily fit the standard evolutionary picture.
So a kind of built-in resistance to anything that challenges the status quo.
That's the implication, yes, a perceived lack of genuine open-mindedness towards different interpretations of the past.
And the book Forbidden Archaeology itself, according to the review, makes another interesting point. It argues that research from, say, the 19th and early 20th centuries should be considered just as valid as modern research.
That is a key element, because if you accept that premise that older research holds equal weight,
then ignoring those older findings while privileging modern data that fits the current model, well, that starts to look like deliberate selection.
it becomes central to the argument for suppression. It really forces us to think about how we curate and interpret historical archaeological records.
Okay, so to really get a handle on this, maybe we should look at a concrete example.
Good idea. The Pierce mortar is a frequently cited one.
Right, the Pierce mortar. What's the story there?
It was discovered way back in 1862, found in a mining tunnel, apparently, in Table Mountain, California.
And the key thing was where in the tunnel?
It was supposedly embedded in what are called tertiary gravels. These are very old geological deposits.
So finding a human-made mortar in such ancient strata would imply, well, incredible antiquity for humans, or human-like beings in that area, far beyond the accepted timeline.
Exactly. That's why it's often held up as a prime example of a forbidden artifact.
But it's not that simple, is it? Our review material raises some questions.
No, it's definitely not simple. The description of the mortar itself is apparently quite vague, lacking precise detail.
Okay.
And critically, the review points out its composition. It was made of andesite,
Which is?
a type of volcanic rock. And the important thing is this rock type matches the geological layers above the mine tunnel where it was supposedly found.
Ah. So it could have come from a younger layer, maybe fallen in, or been washed in?
That's a major possibility the geology raises. Could it have entered the mine much later, either naturally or, through human action? It casts doubt on it being genuinely from that deep old layer.
And there was more to it, wasn't there? Something about the geologist who looked into it.
Yes, Sinclair. He investigated the find and the circumstances, and he was skeptical.
Skeptical about its age.
About its context and maybe even its authenticity. He apparently suspected that another object, a carved tablet, reportedly found by this same person who found the mortar.
Yes.
Sinclair thought that tablet might have been recently etched, possibly using a modern tool.
Wow, okay, so that introduces the H word, hoax.
It certainly does. And the review material emphasizes that hoaxes, archaeological forgeries, were actually quite common during that period, especially in America.
The 19th century was apparently a heyday for faked artifacts, particularly things like inscribed tablets.
So that historical context is crucial. It adds the significant layer of doubt when we look back at finds like the Pierce mortar from that era.
It means we can't just take the discovery report at face value. We need intense scrutiny of the object, the discovery story, and the whole environment it came out of.
Absolutely. Thorough scrutiny is essential.
Okay, let's shift gears slightly. What about other types of evidence mentioned? The review touched on Olduvai Gorge, didn't it?
It did. It mentioned that the book Forbidden Archaeology raises questions about the context of some of the early tool finds there, finds which are generally accepted as evidence for early hominids.
So the book uses that to argue against the mainstream view.
It seems to, yes. But interestingly, the review points out that this actually shows scientists do question their data. The fact that the context of any find, even foundational ones like at Olduvai, can be discussed and debated supports the idea of scientific self-correction.
That's a really important distinction. The criticism inadvertently highlights the process it's critiquing.
Precisely. The review also looks at the debate around eoliths.
Eoliths, those are the really crudely shaped stones, right? Where it's hard to tell if they're naturally broken or actual simple tools.
That's them. Very controversial. Forbidden Archaeology apparently draws parallels between these eoliths and later, more accepted early hominid tools, perhaps suggesting a much earlier origin for tool use.
But the counter-argument.
The review highlights that archaeologists are constantly debating these things anyway. They question the dating, the geological context, especially for surface finds, which are tricky, even things like the sample sizes for hominid fossils found nearby.
So the debate is already happening within the field.
Yes. And it mentions southern Africa, too, regarding Homo erectus and early Acheulean tools.
What about that?
Well, while Homo erectus is likely linked to those tools, the review notes that the exact association at specific sites isn't always crystal clear. There are still questions being worked through.
So again, it shows ongoing research and refinement, not just rigid acceptance or dismissal.
Exactly. It contradicts that picture of a monolithic scientific establishment just shutting down inconvenient data. It seems the process involves a lot of internal skepticism and reevaluation.
Which directly challenges the core claim of automatic rejection of things that don't fit the paradigm.
It certainly does. And the review brings up another powerful point against intentional suppression: the acceptance of evolution itself.
How does that work as a counterargument?
Think about it. The adoption of evolutionary theory, especially after big discoveries like Java Man, was a massive shift. It overturned deeply entrenched views, including biblically based chronology.
It was revolutionary.
So if the scientific community was inherently designed to suppress anything contradicting the established view, how did such a fundamental paradigm shift ever happen?
Good point. Its eventual acceptance demonstrates that science can incorporate radically new evidence, even if it takes time and debate.
It suggests a capacity for change, not inherent systematic suppression. The history of science is full of initially resisted ideas that eventually won out because the evidence piled up.
That historical perspective is quite telling.
And finally, there's a quote in the review from Ding Paz, a reminder about scientific methodology.
What does she say?
She acknowledges that thinking about possibilities, possibilist arguments, is often the first step. It helps identify areas needing investigation.
But there's always a but, isn't there?
But, she cautions, these possibilities are just the start. They indicate a problem domain where the method of multiple hypotheses might be applied.
Meaning, just saying what if isn't enough. You then need to rigorously test different explanations against the actual evidence.
Precisely. Identifying an anomaly or proposing an alternative is the beginning of the scientific work, not the end.
Okay, so this leads us back to considering other ways to interpret the evidence cited by forbidden archaeology proponents.
Right. Alternative interpretations are crucial. We already talked about hoaxes, the Pierce mortar example, the context of 19th century forgeries. That's one major alternative.
Not every weird find has to mean a hidden history. It could just be fake.
Or it could be related to research standards. We have to remember how much archaeological methods have evolved.
You mean what counted as good evidence in, say, 1880 might not hold up today?
Exactly. Dating techniques, excavation methods, documentation, they're worlds apart. So interpreting finds from that era using modern criteria requires real caution and understanding of those historical limitations.
So misinterpretation based on older, less rigorous methods is another possibility.
The very real one.
There was one other point mentioned tangentially in one of the sources about myths from the Graham Hancock interview.
Ah, yes. That wasn't directly linked in our material to specific forbidden artifacts, but it floated the idea that ancient myths might not just be stories.
but a way of encoding and passing down real information about past events or knowledge.
Sort of, yeah. A potential way that knowledge could survive across vast stretches of time outside of written records or archaeology as we know it.
Interesting idea, but as you say, separate from evaluating physical archaeological claims.
It's a different category of potential knowledge, important to distinguish from evidence we can scientifically test and verify.
Okay, so let's try to sum up our deep dive here. We've looked at this hypothesis of intentional concealment forbidden archaeology.
We've examined the core claims, that there's lots of suppressed data, that science is biased against anomalies, citing examples like the Pierce mortar.
And we've also considered the counter-arguments presented in our sources.
Like the fact that science does involve questioning and self-correction, that major paradigm shifts like evolution have happened.
And the very real possibilities of hoaxes or issues with interpreting very old research conducted under different standards.
It really highlights how complex interpreting the archaeological record is. There are genuine debates and unanswered questions about human origins.
Absolutely. But the idea of a deliberate, widespread, perhaps even government-led suppression of evidence, that's a very significant claim.
And a claim like that requires extraordinary proof. Based on the material we reviewed, the burden of that proof doesn't seem to have been met convincingly. Anomalies exist, yes, but jumping to intentional suppression is a huge leap.
The picture that emerges seems less like active concealment and more like the normal, sometimes messy process of scientific inquiry dealing with ambiguous evidence from the deep past.
I think that's a fair assessment based on our sources. The scientific process ideally aims for discovery based on evidence, not hiding things that don't fit.
Thanks for listening to Conspiracist.